21st March 2023, early evening in Plymouth. Legham Manor Drive was almost silent. A Range Rover moved slowly up the lane and a man stepped into view. What happens in the minutes that follow isn't loud or chaotic, but it leaves a question hanging in the dark. How did a brief encounter on a quiet road turn into something fatal? Whereas, on 26 October 2019, in Blackpool, Queen Victoria Road was busy enough for a normal routine. A man cycles home from a nearby shop. Behind him, a black Volkswagen Golf makes another slow pass through the neighborhood. There's no argument, no sign of trouble, but the next few seconds will turn a normal morning into something far more serious, and he has no idea what's coming. Two different cases, both starting with small, ordinary moments that suddenly shifted into something far more serious. What started as nothing unusual and nothing alarming would become two of the most closely examined cases in their communities. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Before the events in Legham Manor Drive, Luke Dan was already a familiar name to many in Plymouth. His reputation had been shaped over decades through the motor trade, local business ventures, and a personal history that drew both sympathy and attention. As a young boy, he had survived leukemia, spending long periods in hospital and later raising funds for children going through similar treatment. By his mid-teens, he was pictured in the local press organising gifts for oncology patients at Derriford Hospital, and throughout those years, he became known as someone who had faced significant illness at a young age, yet worked to support others experiencing the same. As he grew older, he shifted into the business world. By 18, he had opened his first car dealership, eventually running Luke Dan Motors in Horncross Road and later Billacombe Motors in Plymstock. The businesses traded in used vehicles and at times jewellery. Accounts from that period presented him as an ambitious salesman with an early interest in trading and an assertive approach to business. His ventures expanded to include shares in a taxi firm, involvement in a local nightclub, a security company, and property investment, building a profile that made him well recognized within the city. His home in Beechwood Rise, a private wooded enclave near Plimbridge Woods, reflected that success, with vehicles such as a Lamborghini and a Range Rover often parked outside. His name, however, also appeared in connection with a number of police operations over the years. A large-scale raid on his home in 2009 led to the seizure of cash, protective equipment, and items initially treated as suspicious, though no charges were pursued after the investigation collapsed. In 2012, officers seized 18 vehicles from a lot linked to one of his businesses during a money laundering inquiry. ADN more, we will talk about it in a few minutes. A further drugs conspiracy case brought by police in 2017 was discontinued in 2019 after significant disclosure issues. By the time of March 2023, Dan was a well-known figure, part businessman, part contentious name, someone whose past had placed him in headlines more than once. It was against that backdrop, a mix of public recognition, previous court cases, and the profile he had built in Plymouth, that his actions on Legham Manor Drive would soon be examined in detail. Legham Manor Drive sat in the kind of darkness that makes a road feel narrower than it is. No streetlights, no passing headlights, just the odd reflection from rain on the tarmac. Earlier, David Kelly had been at Parkside Caravan Park with two women, Laura Smith and Lorraine Smart. Witnesses later described him as being under the influence, alcohol, cocaine, and other substances, leaving him restless and unpredictable. His behavior escalated through the evening, becoming aggressive enough for one witness to call him off his rocker. It was during this time the plan was made for a dealer to arrive with cocaine for the group, and that decision began moving everyone slowly towards Legham Manor Drive. Before he ever reached the lane, Kelly had already alarmed others. As a couple in a Tesla prepared to leave the caravan park, he confronted them abruptly, leaving them unsettled enough to drive away immediately. From there, he got into Laura Smith's black Audi as she headed out towards the next store, looking for the dealer who had been called to supply them. At roughly the same time, Luke Dan was making his own way home from a snooker club, driving his 2013 black Range Rover back towards the quiet estate where he lived. Neither man knew the other. Neither had any reason to expect a confrontation, yet both were heading into the same unlit lane, a coincidence later described by the judge as tragic in every sense. The first claims and contradictions were about to take shape, and they would set the tone for everything that followed. Dan passed Smith's Audi at the lower end of Layham Manor Drive and continued only a short distance before stopping. Rather than carrying on towards home, he turned the Range Rover around so it now faced back towards the direction of the retail park. In court, the judge described this as a deliberate act, concluding it was not an attempt to leave, but a choice to place himself facing Kelly from inside the vehicle. When Smith re-entered the lane minutes later, Kelly was positioned directly in front of the Range Rover. She described him as unsteady, aggressive, and visibly affected by substances he had taken earlier. His behavior escalated quickly. He shouted, swore, kicked the bonnet, struck the front of the vehicle with his hands, and damaged the wing mirror during the outburst. The agitation she had witnessed earlier at the caravan park was still present, and his stance in the road made it clear he was not stepping aside. Other witnesses supported what Smith saw. Dog walkers further along the lane heard raised voices coming from the direction of the vehicle, confirming both men were shouting. Their accounts indicated a volatile standoff, not a brief exchange. Smith attempted to intervene. She tried to calm Kelly and then spoke to Dan in an effort to steady the situation. According to her evidence, he responded with a crude insult, showing irritation rather than any sign of fear or panic. The judge later highlighted this, noting that nothing in Dan's demeanor matched the defense claim of a man acting out of terror. In the final moments before the collision, Kelly remained directly in front of the Range Rover. Dan did not reverse, steer around him, use the horn, or attempt to warn him. Instead, the vehicle moved forward at a low speed, estimated between 0 and 10 miles per hour. The impact pushed Kelly beneath the vehicle. Forensic analysis showed the wheel path clearly, first over his thigh, then across his torso, and finally over his face and head. The injuries were catastrophic and immediately fatal. After the collision, Dan continued driving for approximately 100 yards. This movement became a significant part of the court's assessment. The continued travel suggested purposeful driving rather than an uncontrolled reaction. When he eventually stopped, it was because another vehicle was ahead of him in the lane. Witnesses inside that vehicle saw him pause and then reverse. The judge later stated that this behavior was inconsistent with a person acting in panic or fleeing an attack, as the defense had argued. The minutes that followed would reveal how others discovered what had happened, and how Dan chose to explain it when he made his first calls and his next stop. A short distance down the lane, 2 dog walkers came across Kelly lying in the road. The extent of his injuries was immediately clear, and they began CPR in an attempt to keep him alive while emergency services were called. The scene was quiet, except for their efforts and the sound of distant traffic from the retail park. During the same period, Dan made his 999 call. His voice sounded distressed as he told the operator he had been attacked and had driven away in fear. What he did not mention was that he had run over a man moments earlier. The omission became a significant point in court, where the judge later remarked that the purpose of the call appeared to be the building of a defense narrative rather than an attempt to summon aid for Kelly. The details he focused on were his own fear and his account of an assault, not the fact that someone now lay critically injured in the road he had just left behind. After ending the call, Dan drove to the Marsh Mills retail park and pulled into the Costa Coffee car park. There, he repeated the same story to those around him, that he had been attacked and had left the scene to escape. But again, his account lacked specifics. There was no explanation of how the confrontation unfolded, and his manner, as later described in evidence, suggested anxiety about what had happened, but also a reluctance to disclose his involvement in the fatal injuries. Police units soon arrived at the coffee shop. Body-worn video captured the moment officers approached the Range Rover, spoke with Dan, and placed him under arrest. Even then, with officers searching the vehicle and assessing the situation, he continued to avoid any reference to having driven over Kelly. The story he had chosen to present, of being attacked and fleeing, remained the only version he offered, despite the evidence already beginning to form around him elsewhere in the city. Once the scene was examined and the Range Rover had been seized from the Costa car park, investigators moved quickly through the technical work that would shape the case. Collision specialists analyzed the vehicle's movements in the lane using tire marks, ground impressions, and the damage pattern on the car itself. Their findings confirmed the sequence later presented in court. The Range Rover had advanced in a straight line, without evasive steering or braking, and Kelly had gone beneath the vehicle exactly as the physical evidence suggested. The wheel path documented through forensic imaging matched the injuries as we discussed earlier. The pathology report reinforced the severity of the impact. The Home Office pathologist documented catastrophic trauma, extensive skull fractures, major brain injury, and a torn arterial structure within the chest, creating immediate, rapid, internal blood loss. These findings aligned precisely with the collision analysis, leaving no uncertainty about the nature and fatal outcome of the contact. Toxicological testing provided context for Kelly's behavior earlier that evening. He had been described as unsteady and volatile, and the toxicology report supported those accounts. As the case progressed, jurors were shown images of the Range Rover as it appeared when officers arrived at Costa, a key piece of visual evidence. Alongside the forensic findings, the court also heard about Dan's previous convictions: an assault occasioning actual bodily harm in 2013 and an offense of perverting the course of justice in 2014. Both were part of the broader picture the court was legally permitted to consider. These combined findings, physical, medical, toxicological, and testimonial, formed the evidential basis for what the jury would later evaluate in the courtroom. When the case reached Plymouth Crown Court, the jury were presented with the full structure of the evidence. Along with the prosecution's assertion that Dan had deliberately driven towards Kelly, and the defense argument that he had acted out of fear after claiming he had been attacked in the lane. Jurors were also permitted to consider two alternative charges alongside murder: manslaughter and causing death by dangerous driving. The trial stretched over several days, with the judge outlining the key questions the jury needed to determine. Dan's intention at the moment he advanced the Range Rover, the credibility of his claims to police, and the explanation behind the absence of any attempt to avoid contact with Kelly. The jury were shown photographs of the Range Rover taken at Costa, demonstrating the marks, damage. Throughout the trial, the judge highlighted the discrepancies between Dan's statements and the evidence presented. The suggestion that he had been struck by a blow as he passed another car was dismissed as implausible. After deliberating, the jury cleared Dan of murder, but found him guilty of manslaughter. The judge then addressed the sentencing. He noted the deliberate turnaround in the lane, the use of the vehicle as a weapon, and the absence of fear in Dan's behavior. Dan, aged 37, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with 2/3 to be served before release. He was also disqualified from driving for 7 years, and the court issued a deprivation order for his Range Rover, valued at just over £20,000. And long before the events in Plymouth, another incident in Blackpool had already set a different investigation in motion. By late October 2019, a group from London had made their way up to Blackpool, basing themselves in a flat on Central Drive. The property became their point of stay during the days leading up to the incident, a place where they slept, moved in and out of at irregular hours, and prepared for whatever brought them to the resort town. The group consisted of several men: Sean Carrington, Gracia, Kingsley Cumberbatch, Adewale Erican, and Joseph Fraser. They travelled together, stayed together, and in the days that followed were seen across different parts of the town, in a black Volkswagen Golf that would later become central to the investigation. Inside that flat, one detail stood out in the evidence: Carrington's fixation with knives. Police recovered footage he had recorded showing large, distinctive blades, described in court as ferocious in both size and design. He appeared to admire them, display them, and talk about them. It was not a new interest. Carrington already had a prior conviction for stabbing someone in the back, something the prosecution noted when presenting the context around his behavior during the days in Blackpool. The presence of those videos, paired with his record, set a tone the jury would later examine closely. Meanwhile, the VW Golf was captured repeatedly on CCTV across the North Shore area. Over a series of passes, the car was seen travelling along streets including Grasmere Road, Bella Grove and Wire Grove. The movements were not isolated. The Golf returned to the same routes multiple times in the same morning, driving slowly through the residential streets before circling back again. This was the quiet build-up: a flat on Central Drive, a group of men far from home, a car moving through Blackpool's side streets, and a man within that group whose interest in knives had already left a mark on his past. The day before the fatal incident, another act of violence had already taken place on Blackpool's streets. On 25th October, Robbie Harrison was attacked in what the court later described as a targeted robbery. He had been out in the area when he was confronted, punched repeatedly and stabbed before his phone was taken from him. The injuries he sustained were severe: 2 fractured cheekbones, several missing teeth, and a stab wound to his buttock. The violence was brief but intense, leaving him requiring immediate medical treatment and forming a significant part of the wider picture around the group's movements that week. During the investigation, attention turned to who had been responsible. The evidence pointed to 2 members of the London group, Sean Carrington and Kingsley Cumberbatch. Both were later convicted of robbery in relation to the assault on Harrison. Their connection to the incident became even clearer when officers searching the Central Drive flat recovered Harrison's stolen phone among the group's belongings. The device linked the robbery directly back to their temporary base, placing them at the center of the violence that had unfolded the previous day. An additional piece of evidence came from a motorist, Joseph Walsh, who was driving in the area at the time. He gave an account of seeing part of the attack and later identified one of the men he believed had been involved. His description helped shape the early phase of the investigation. On the morning of the 26th of October, 2019, the events that would end in a fatal stabbing began with something completely routine. Chris Cam left his home with his friend's bank card, planning only to withdraw £10 from the nearby McCall's shop. After taking the cash from the ATM, he set off back along Queen Victoria Road, cycling the short route home in broad daylight. There was nothing unusual about his journey, but at the same time, CCTV captured the same black Volkswagen Golf making repeated passes through the surrounding streets. Officers would later confirm that the car had been circling the area that morning, although its purpose was never fully explained. The prosecution later suggested a tragic possibility: that the men inside the Golf believed Cam was connected to a rival group. Lancashire police supported that assessment, stating that he had been attacked on the wholly mistaken belief that he was linked to people the group were in conflict with. In reality, Cam had no involvement in anything of the sort. He was simply cycling home. At around 11:15 a.m., as he reached the junction near Levens Grove, the Golf pulled up beside him. Several men got out. Cam was knocked from his bike, forced onto the ground and surrounded. What followed was a rapid and sustained assault. He was punched, kicked and unable to defend himself. Among those present, the central figure was identified as Christopher Carrington. He delivered 3 stab wounds to Cam's upper leg, one of which severed an artery. It was a single injury among the 3, but it was catastrophic and would later prove fatal. 2 witnesses saw parts of the attack unfold. A 12-year-old boy, watching from the height of a disused shipping container, saw the men descend on Cam. Another witness, a woman living nearby, heard shouting in the street, including Cam's desperate cries. Within moments, the attackers retreated to the Golf and fled the scene. They left Cam bleeding heavily on the pavement, his bike lying where it had fallen. What followed was a race to save his life, one that would ultimately come too late. In the moments after the attackers fled, members of the public rushed towards Chris Cam as he lay on Queen Victoria Road. The severity of his injuries was immediately obvious. He was losing blood quickly from the deep wound in his upper left thigh, and those at the scene attempted to stem the bleeding while waiting for emergency services to arrive. Their efforts were urgent and unwavering, but the situation was already critical. Paramedics reached the scene shortly afterward and continued attempts to stabilize him. Given the extent of blood loss and the location of the injuries, every minute mattered. Cam was taken by ambulance to Blackpool Victoria Hospital, where the trauma team began work immediately. Surgeons attempted to repair the damaged artery and control the internal bleeding. For a time, there was hope that the intervention might be enough. But the injury inflicted during the attack had cut through a major artery, and the blood loss had been both rapid and severe. Despite surgery and intensive care, his condition continued to decline. On the evening of the 27th of October, roughly 33 hours after the assault, Chris Cam passed away in hospital. A post-mortem examination later confirmed the details of what the medical team had already been working against. Cam had suffered 3 stab wounds to his leg, but it was the wound to the back of his left thigh, the one that severed the artery, that proved fatal. The pathologist described the injury as causing massive and rapid internal bleeding, leaving no realistic chance of survival without immediate and advanced medical intervention. His death marked the start of a full-scale murder investigation, one that would bring police back to the same London group seen travelling through Blackpool that morning. The investigation into Chris Cam's death began immediately, with the black Volkswagen Golf becoming the central focus from the earlier stages. CCTV from the surrounding streets allowed officers to map the vehicle's movements both before and after the attack. This footage, combined with witness accounts, provided the starting point for Lancashire police as they traced the car and the individuals linked to it. Within hours, multiple suspects were identified. Over the following days, 6 men aged between 18 and 28 were arrested on suspicion of murder, along with a 31-year-old woman held on suspicion of assisting offenders. The arrests reflected the scale of the incident and the number of people believed to have been travelling together in Blackpool that weekend. The investigation also led officers back to the flat on Central Drive, where further evidence tied the suspects to the previous day's robbery and to Cam's attackers. Once the suspects were interviewed and evidence collated, 5 men were formally charged with murder. Christopher Carrington, 25, Kevin Gracia, 25, Shaquille Cumberbatch, 26, Munachismo Erican, 27, and Try Fraser, 18. All 5 appeared at Preston Crown Court, sitting side by side in the dock as they were informed of the allegations against them. None entered pleas at that early stage. The case was considered serious and complex enough that a full trial date was set months in advance, scheduled for 7th April 2020, with a further plea hearing arranged for January of that year. When the trial opened at Preston Crown Court, the jury were presented with a wide range of evidence charting the movements of the group and the events leading up to the fatal attack. CCTV became one of the most significant elements of the trial, and forensic evidence was equally central. Across the defendants, the responses varied. Some exercised their right to remain silent. Others attempted to distance themselves from the stabbing or from each other. Munachismo Erican claimed he had travelled to Blackpool simply to chill after plans in Manchester fell through. None of the explanations, however, altered the central forensic and CCTV findings. When the jury retired, they did so after a month of evidence. Their verdicts drew a clear line. Carrington and Gracia were found guilty of manslaughter in relation to Chris Cam's death. Christopher Carrington received the most severe penalty. He was jailed for 20 years with an additional 3-year extended license. Kevin Gracia was sentenced to 9 years and 9 months. Carrington was also found guilty of robbery for the attack on Robbie Harrison, alongside Cumberbatch, who received 7 years and 6 months imprisonment. Erican was found not guilty on all counts. The case against Try Fraser had been withdrawn earlier and did not proceed to verdict. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK crime documentaries.